Good evening, everybody. Welcome to P&P Live. My name is Beth Wong, and I'm an event coordinator at Politics and Prose. Thank you so much for joining us in this new format where we continue our proud tradition of bringing the authors you love and their new books to the Politics and Prose community. At any time during the event tonight, you can click on the green button below to purchase tonight's book on P&P's website. Our physical stores are closed, and we do need your online purchases in order to keep bringing you the programming that P&P is known for. Another way to support Politics and Prose tonight is by using the donate button in white text at the bottom of your screens and contributing whatever you are able. This evening, you can ask the author a question by clicking on Ask a Question found near the bottom of your screen. There you can also read other people's questions and even vote for the ones you'd like to hear answered the most. We want to thank you so much for being here with us tonight. And now on to the main event. In Galileo and the Science Deniers, astrophysicist and best-selling author Dr. Mario Livio draws on his own scientific expertise to provide captivating insights into how Galileo reached his bold new conclusions about the cosmos and the laws of nature. Dr. Livio is joined tonight by Dr. Steve Strogatz, mathematician and the Jacob Gould Sherman Professor of Applied Mathematics at Cornell University. Welcome, professors.
Thank you very much. All right, hi everybody. I have the honor of being the interviewer of Mario Livio tonight, and I just want to express my admiration for this author and writer and scientist. But more than that, if you have very good eyes, you may be able to see behind his head a book by Pete Mondrian, or about Pete Mondrian. It's something I've noticed in all the talks or books of Dr. Livio, that he loves art, music. He often writes about history, philosophy. For him, it's all one big universe of learning and thinking and creativity and curiosity. So it seems very appropriate because your subject tonight was just such a Renaissance person, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, it's true. I love art and I love music, but I am a physicist by training. And in more recent years, I also started writing books, but I try to somehow combine my love for art into my writing whenever I can. And Galileo is a very good example for this because he himself loved the arts, he loved the humanities, he was an expert in poetry of the time. I mean, he could recite Dante and Ariosto and Tasso, and he was an accomplished musician. He was a lute player. His father was a musicologist and a musician, and he played with him sometimes, the second lute. And he was also interested in the visual arts. I mean, Cigoli was a famous painter. He was his personal friend, and other painters such as Artemisia Gentileschi consulted with him on some paintings and things like that.
Well, it's a side of Galileo that we don't often hear about, right? I mean, the traditional Galileo is this hero of the scientific method. What about that? So maybe you should first give us the traditional view and tell us about your view of him. How is it different, or is it an amplification of the traditional view? What is the story, you think?
So the story, I think, generally the story is correct. Galileo was a great scientist, and he was, to a large extent, one of the founders of what we call today the scientific method. In the following sense, the physics or science that came from the ancient Greeks was such that it was not very much based on experiments or on observations. There is a famous story that Aristotle, for example, thought that women have a different number of teeth than men. And he was a married person, but it never occurred to him to actually count the teeth of his wife to tell whether the number was indeed different or not. Basically, Aristotle and Plato, as great as they were, I mean, I don't want to take anything away from them, but they thought that if you want to understand nature and the universe, you have to sit down and think about it. Galileo started indeed with thought experiments, and thinking what might be the results of something, but quickly evolved to actually making experiments. And those experiments were mostly in mechanics, experiments that had to do with free fall, things like that. And then after the invention of the telescope, which he perfected, he to also observations of the heavens and, starting, modern, well, not the only person. I mean, there were Kepler and others, but, doing very interesting experiments and observations in modern astronomy. At the same time, indeed, his artistic education came in handy. In one case in particular that I would mention is his observations of the moon. He observed the moon and he saw various features on the moon. But you see, at the same time, I mean, there was this British astronomer Harriot who also observed the moon and also saw features on the moon. But if you look at the drawings that Harriot made of his observations and Galileo made of his observations, there is a huge difference in the sense that Harriot's drawings look more like doodles, while Galileo used the fact that he actually had an education in drawing. So and not only that, he understood chiaroscuro, he understood light and shadow and all that. So from the features that he saw, he managed to conclude that the surface of the moon was rugged, that there were craters, there were mountains. He saw that the terminator, that divides the illuminated side from the unilluminated side is not a straight, smooth line, but it's jagged. So he understood that means that the surface is rugged. He understood that the points of lights he sees in the unilluminated side represent tops of mountains that get illuminated by the sun, and then the light creeps down the mountain and so on. So his artistic education helped him in understanding the science.
Wow, that is a really interesting point. That not only, let me see if maybe I'm going too far with this, but not only did it help him understand the science, but I think from what you're saying, it helped him convey the significance of his own findings, that he was a very persuasive, skilled person with rhetoric, with argumentation, with sarcasm, with wit.
Yes, he was, let me make it very clear. One thing he wasn't the nicest person on earth. No. He could be very supportive to his own family, but when it came, for example, to opponents or to people who disagreed with him, his tongue and even more so his pen could be extremely sharp. And he really did not suffer disagreements with him. Now, much of the time he was right, yes, but at others, even when he was not right, he was still very aggressive in his behavior and so on. But just to give you one example, because you mentioned his sarcasm.
Yeah, sure.
In one argument he had with a famous Jesuit mathematician, this was about the nature of comments and heat and the nature of heat. And that mathematician wrote, he brought in an ancient story that the Babylonians were cooking their eggs by whirling them on a sling. Yes. And then when Galileo wrote back, he wrote this book, The Essayer, where he tried to argue with his person, Grassi. He said, well, let's look at this story for a second. He said, when we have an effect and we don't succeed in doing it, we have to understand why we don't succeed. So, we don't lack strong guys who can whirl the eggs, and we certainly have eggs and we have slings, and yet when we do that, the eggs don't cook. So why is that? What do we miss that they had? He said, the only thing we missed is that they were Babylonians. So it must be that being a Babylonian, that's what cooks the eggs.
Uh-huh. No, he was a tough character. You didn't want to be on the wrong side of Galileo. But back to this question then of what is different about your Galileo than the ones that we learned about in school. You must have discovered some things about him that are not little appreciated, or that are relatively little appreciated, or maybe even unknown. Were there some surprises for you in your research?
Yeah, there were, and there was also one piece actually that it took me so long to research that I actually ended up not putting it in the book, but actually in a separate article which was published a few weeks ago by Scientific American. The book itself appeared a month ago. And that was, about his most famous motto.
Yeah.
Galileo's most famous motto is "Eppur si muove," which means "and yet it moves." And the legend went that once he, recanted and the abjuration on his trial, that he had to take back the fact that the Earth revolves around the sun and all that. The legend said that when he got up from that, he murmured, to himself, mumbled. He said, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves, in defiance, of that thing. And I decided to research. Everybody knew that he couldn't have said it in front of the Inquisition. That was clear. But the question was, did he say it at all? Uh-huh. And a number of Galileo scholars got convinced, including some of the most famous ones, that he may have said it to his host in Siena when he was in the first months of his house arrest, that he may have said it there. And yet it moves. Mm-hmm. Well, I started researching this, and I discovered that in written text, the first time that this appears is more than a century after Galileo's death. This was known. But in 1911, there was a story that somebody came up with a painting which was supposedly from a couple of years after Galileo's death only, which had the motto on it. Uh-huh. And the painting was attributed to the great Spanish painter Bartolomé Esteban Murillo. And there was a whole story around it, how it came about. I will not tell you the whole story now, but I started looking about that painting and the person who owned the painting and so on. I'll make a very long story short and just tell you that I discovered that painting was most probably not painted in the 17th century. In fact, that it was a copy of a painting from the middle 19th century. Uh-huh. And therefore, the very first evidence for that motto is more than a century after Galileo's death. So I would say it's most certainly apocryphal.
Yeah, that's too bad because, it's an interesting example of, we have a lot of these myths in the history of science that can be very inspiring. Even if they're not true, they're such good stories. We want them to be true. And they seem like they capture the essence of something true.
Look, there is no doubt. Let me make this clear. There is no doubt that Galileo thought that way.
Right.
There is no doubt that he thought that way.
Yeah.
All my research was about, did he actually say those words? And, sure. and for today, this remains, had he said it or not, it remains such a powerful statement, because it's against all types of science denial, basically it conveys the message, look, in spite of what you may believe, these are the facts.
Okay, right. So now we're getting into the second half of the title of your book, right? It's Galileo and the Science Deniers. So let us, I think probably most folks here in our session are familiar with the story, but why don't you just briefly remind us what is the issue with the science denial of Galileo, and then let's go into talk about why you think this story is so relevant to us today.
So look, when Galileo's story is being told, very often it is described as a clash between science and religion. Now, Galileo himself never saw it as a clash between science and religion. he saw it as a clash between literal interpretations of the Bible and science. And his argument was that the Bible was never intended to be a science book. And he made many points to this effect, that it was not intended as a science book. He said, look, in the Bible, not even all the planets are named, he said. Plus, he said, the Bible was written, and, he was relying even on St. Augustine and, on many others. The Bible was written for our salvation, not to teach us science.
Yes.
He was relying also on, there was a famous cardinal, Cesare Baronio, who said that the Bible basically teaches us how to go to heaven and not how the heavens go. Yes. So, that type of thing, namely, the Bible, he said, was written for our salvation, not as a book of science. And finally, his most powerful sentence was that he didn't believe that the same God who has given us our senses and intelligence and reason wanted us to abandon their use. So basically, he was arguing that whenever there is an apparent conflict between literal interpretations of the Bible and what observations and experiments tell you, then it means that you just didn't understand the meaning, because the meaning there, was more metaphorical and so on. So this was his main point. And look, whatever you may think of this, and whatever the people of his time think of this, Pope John Paul II in 1992 specifically admitted that Galileo was right. He stated specifically that Galileo was right and the theologians of his time were wrong because they did not understand the difference between literal interpretations and, and just a metaphorical interpretation.
Well, okay, I wanted to also carry on to present day science denial, but actually before we do, I would like to stay in the 1600s briefly, because you raise an interesting point with the role of God and revelation of a kind, so I'm thinking here of Kepler, who you mentioned earlier, Johannes Kepler, a great contemporary who also worked very much in astrophysics, maybe one of the first astrophysicists. And Kepler was extremely devout. I mean, Kepler was trained to be a minister. And he wrote about some of his discoveries, that he experienced a kind of sacred frenzy. That was the term he used, a sacred frenzy on discovering some of these laws of planetary motion, because he felt that he was revealing God's handiwork. And I wonder if you pick anything of that in Galileo's work. Does he think that it's important to get the laws right because these are God's laws?
Yes, absolutely true. Absolutely true. Even though some, people who don't like Galileo will deny that. But Galileo actually was in the opinion that God speaks not only through the scripture, but also through nature. And therefore, the discovery of what nature is all about also is about the discovery of the work of God. Yes, absolutely. So, the slight difference between the two is that Kepler was in some sense a mystic.
Yes, right.
And Galileo was not really. He was not a mystic.
I see it the same way as you on that point. I always think of Galileo as more the heir to Archimedes and Kepler more the heir to Pythagoras. I think that is perhaps a good analogy. It's a very simplistic way to put it, but I think they were both inspired, just two different Greeks. But okay, so bringing it to today then, I think it's pretty clear there's a lot of science denial in all sorts of places, in our culture, in the White House, in various other places. But is this part of why you're writing the book now? Why Galileo 400 years later? So it is part of that, yes. I sort of listed three motivations for writing the book, and I think they remain true.
So one of them had to do with the fact that I'm an astrophysicist, working astrophysicist, and I always admired Galileo. I always was fascinated by him. I always knew of his shortcomings, which were many, but I saw that as a part of his very complex personality, which fascinated me. That was one reason. A second reason had to do indeed with the science denialism. I mean, we see too much of it today. I mean, climate change is, of course, one big issue where we see this. We see this in people who refuse to vaccinate their children. We have seen this in the very early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. Statements such as, we now have 15 cases, which soon is going to be down to 0, which things of that nature. We see this in people who want to teach creationism in science classes, not as a part of history, but in science classes. So yeah, that was part of the reason that I wanted. And the third part, which is also very, very important, and this is where maybe no science historians would agree with me. There are quite a few wonderful biographies of Galileo. Really, quite a few excellent biographies, superb biographies of Galileo. But they were written mostly as scholarly books. They were written by historians of science as scholarly books. And the result of that was that even though most people heard about Galileo, actually I discovered that most people have never actually read those books because they are far too detailed and contain far too many arguments for and against, and so on, which are difficult for the educated person to follow. And I my most interesting encounter was with a friend of mine who's a scientist, who was an active scientist. And I told him I'm writing a book about Galileo. He said, remind me what it is that he did.
No.
Yeah, so even at this level. So I decided to write a shorter book, a more, in a more popular language book, but nevertheless, in my opinion, at least keeping it as accurate as possible without getting into the finest details back and forth. And, all I can say is that I consulted with 4 Galileo scholars while writing the book. One of them is, in my opinion, one of the greatest living Galileo scholars, Michele Camerota. I was very heartened to, when he told me, you wrote a popular book, but which is very accurate.
Oh, good. Yeah, good.
So,
well, I mean, I sympathize with this because as a in my case, mathematician, but someone who is not a professional historian, not any kind of historian, but I like to try to enliven my books with history, of the stories of the great figures. And also, I mean, I'm really interested in that. I think a lot of people are interested. It gives an entry point for many readers. Yet I often find, and I guess maybe you have too, that certain historians feel very possessive of their field, and they have their own standards of how history should be written, sometimes not so sympathetic to what someone like you is trying to do. For instance, let me just wear that hat for a minute and see how you would respond. This argument that Galileo tells us something about science denialism today is you might be accused of what they like to call Whig history, right? This is where you sort of talk about history as if it's all leading up to the present moment, and we view it from the wrong end of the telescope. Instead of immersing ourselves in the 1600s, I haven't formed a well-posed question here, but
but I fully understand what you're saying. And look, I think I I tried to make it very clear in the book, at least I hope, that I do not make a precise comparison between what happened then and what happens now. For example, I talk about science denial. In Galileo's time, at least my interpretation of this, not everybody may agree, I completely agree with you, but my interpretation is that this was a clash between literal interpretations of the Bible and scientific things. Now, it is true, let me make this very clear. It is true that Galileo did not prove everything. For example, he couldn't prove that the Earth was truly moving. He could completely discredit the Ptolemaic model in which all the planets and the sun and the moon all revolved around the Earth. That he could discredit very, very legitimately. But he couldn't prove the Copernican model in which the Earth itself was moving. And in fact, there were some arguments which were not bad arguments why the Earth was not moving. Okay? But nevertheless, it brought it to a point where there were two theories that more or less explained the fact, but one was, at least in my scientific opinion, a simpler picture than the other. And when we scientists reach such a point, we normally say, okay, until proven otherwise, I will adopt the simpler picture. And this was partly the reason why Kepler himself, for example, adopted the Copernican system. Yes, and in fact, many Protestant astronomers at the time adopted that kind of view. In fact, one of them, there was a German cardinal who tried to convince the Pope Urban VIII, to say, look, the church may end up looking silly if we don't move to this new model, which now, most Protestants believe in. So this was the type of situation then. Now, you look at science denial today. I mentioned climate change. And you ask yourself, what are the main reasons for people who object to climate change? They are not religiosity. They are not literal interpretations of the Bible. There are a few who say that too, that they cannot believe that humans can change the weather and things like that. Yes, there are a few like that. But most of it is political conservatism of certain points. So it's not directly comparable to the denialism in Galileo's time. When you look at people who object to other, things, what had to do with the coronavirus, at the beginning. Why were these statements made that, it's nothing and we are under control, everything is under control and so on? These were clearly political reasons that have to do with the fact that we are in an election year and things like that and so on, right? It has nothing to do with religiosity. So I don't try to make the parallels too precise. But the effect at the end is the same. The effect is that the science is not followed. And the fact is that even though Galileo couldn't quite prove everything he set out to prove, when the church itself asked, this person named Pasquini to write a new biography of Galileo, he concluded that Galileo was more convincing than the opponents. He said, yeah, he didn't prove that the Earth moved, but there wasn't much proof for the other system, or better proof for the other system. So
another aspect of this with, contemporary and science denial, and also the historical in Galileo's time, is the question of what the establishment thinks. You will find people, let's talk about climate.
You froze for me. Your picture froze for me.
Hi, Stephen. Yeah, if you could refresh your browser, it'll take you out for a second, but it'll restart your video.
Mine or Steve?
Steve, not you. Sorry, Professor Livio.
Steve,
I'm hoping you can hear us.
yeah, I don't know. Steve, can you refresh your browser? I don't know if he hears us.
Yeah.
He froze on us.
Just a moment. Sorry, everybody. Oh, there you are. You're back.
I'm back. Am I unfrozen?
Yes, you
Yeah,
are.
yeah, now you are unfrozen, yes.
Okay, I'm
So,
back.
so please ask
All
your
right,
question again, because I
let me try
didn't
to
hear
ask
it.
again. What I was trying to ask was the question of being against the establishment. I see some people nowadays who, although they're denying what I want to call the reality of climate change, they say, well, so what if 99% of scientists, or whatever the large number is, say that human-induced climate change is real, and that humans are the primary cause, and that it's not just fluctuations that happen from time to time. So what if 98, 99% say that? Science is not a democracy. And they see themselves as Galileo.
Yes. Yeah, this is a completely false logic. It's true that there are people who say that, but it has even gotten a name. It's called the Galileo Gambit. And it is a false logic, because basically what this statement says is, because I am one against the 99% and Galileo was one against the mainstream and he turned out to be right, then I need to be right too. But Galileo was right because he was right, not because he was one against the many. Most of the time, when you are one against the many, you're wrong. Most of the time. In rare occasions, you happen to be right. And Galileo's case was one such case. But, you know, so it really does, that logic doesn't work at all.
Well, all right. So I'm going to click on some questions here from the audience. Let's see what we've got. So I see 5 people have suggested questions. I mean, this one is close to what we were just talking about. It says, great job, Professor Livio. However, during Galileo's time, there were few scientists, but today there's an inflation of, quote, experts. Now, I'm not sure what the thrust of the question is exactly. I guess it's that things are
maybe that it's harder to tell because not all of them have the same opinions. Maybe.
I'm not sure what to say.
Well, let me assume that that's the question, that there are many experts and they don't always have the same opinion. So I would say the following. Look, scientists are not always right. Scientists, in fact, most scientists, I would say, would be the first to recognize that they can be wrong. But science is really only provisional, always, because the science is as good as the data available at the time. But science also self-corrects, and it has this incredible capacity to self-correct. Look, the reason, for example, Wikipedia works most of the time is because many people read it, and when they see a mistake, they try to correct it. It's not perfect, but it is, you know, much of the time it is correct. And, you know, for example, in the case of the current pandemic, the recommendations somewhat changed over time because the data were changing. And as more data was accumulated, you know, the recommendations became better as well. So we don't have at the moment anything better to follow than the science.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask this question from Denise Schweitzer. She says, or asks, what is the best way to combat science denialism today?
Yeah, I've been asked this question ever since I wrote the book.
Okay.
And I wish I knew the answer to this. Let me just say the following. One thing that I noticed is that once people who are already adults have formed an opinion, it is extraordinarily difficult to change their opinion, even when you present them with completely contradictory facts to what their opinion says. And as a result of this, I think my conclusion has to be that the only way on the somewhat longer term to combat science denial is to start with the education system from very small children and to teach them a certain understanding of science, not to be scientists, but a certain appreciation of science, to understand what science does for us, to understand that we live today on the average twice longer than what they lived in Galileo's time, and that's only because of science. That to understand that the difference, the main difference between medieval times and today has to do with science. And you know, there is a quote which I really like to repeat because it is so clever and it is so, it outlines the dangers. This is from philosopher Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt once wrote that the most likely subjects for totalitarian rule are not those who are convinced Nazis or convinced communists. It is those for whom the difference between fact and fiction or between true and false stopped to exist.
Yes.
That those are the ideal subjects for totalitarian rule. So we really must follow the science in many of these cases. Plus, you see, it is never a good idea to bet against the science. But in the case of climate change, or in the case of a pandemic, we're talking life and death type decisions, either for some individuals or for, life on Earth or things like that. It's unconscionable to bet against the science in such circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me lighten it up with this question that comes from Beth, which is back to the theme of art and science, the fusion of those two. She asks, I wonder how Galileo's fusion of art and science might be manifested today. Do contemporary astrophysicists have much to learn from the arts?
Okay. I'm sure they have some things to learn, but I would be wrong if I would say that most astrophysicists like the arts. I'm sure some of them like some parts of art, but people today tend to be much more specialized and more focused in their areas of expertise. And we don't have that many polymaths or Renaissance people today. Mm-hmm. But we do have some. And I think that we will have more. And the reason I say that is because of two things. There is this legend about the 10,000 hours rule, mm-hmm. that, to become an expert, you need to spend 10,000 hours on something. Well, it's not obvious that that's actually true, but because the original people who did the research have taken that, said that this is a wrong interpretation of their results. But nevertheless, today, first of all, we have a much easier access to information. Yes, I mean, literally at the tips of our fingers, with our computers or cell phones even. Yeah, mm-hmm. That's one thing. So we can get the information much faster. And second, we live much longer than once. So even with the 10,000 hours, there is still time today for people to become experts in more than one field. So I believe that there is a room for, the polymaths of today, certainly in some areas. I'm not sure if astrophysics is the main thing, but in many other things. Look, in astrophysics, I'll say the following. You see, art, in art, we sort of try to describe our response, right, to the universe, mm-hmm. Our emotional response. In science, we try to explain, to make predictions about the universe, right? mostly. But look at, for example, Hubble images, okay, images from the Hubble Space Telescope.
Right.
I mean, one writer for The Guardian once wrote that this is like the Sistine Chapel of our time. Because in addition to their scientific value, they have this incredible, we find them so emotionally attractive. And I believe that emotional response contributes to, how even the scientists feel about the data and the findings.
No, I think it's a really important point, that point that you were just hitting on. I mean, I kept thinking the whole time of Cassini, the images of Saturn, the Hubble images, or even Carl Sagan, who I think we would call an astrophysicist, with the pale blue dot, the pale blue dot, the turning back as leaving the solar system and taking that image, and then the poetry that he wrote about it, the rivers of blood and all that stuff.
And look, and Steve, I mean, the books you write about mathematics, and I've written a few too about popular mathematics, but the books you write about mathematics is Joy of X, and Infinite Power and things like that. You try to bring out the beauty. I mean, there is no other word for this, right? The beauty of those things, as well as the application, and and that you use it everywhere and things like that.
Well, I think we're all animated by something like that, a sense of awe. Uh-oh, did I freeze? Did you freeze? No?
You froze for a second.
Oh, okay. Anyway, yes, those feelings of reverence and beauty and wonder, that's part of what gets us all up in the morning, whether we're artists or scientists. Well, let me take another question here from the audience. I see...
I lost your image.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Here's a question from Terry Provence, who asks, or maybe it's Province, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Terry, but the question is, how much does Copernicus play in Galileo's science?
Well, Galileo is a strong advocate for the Copernican system. Copernicus, of course, is the person who suggested, he was not completely the first. I mean, in the ancient Greeks, Aristarchus also suggested something like this, but Copernicus suggested this model in which all the planets revolve around the sun. So in that sense, I mean, he really started this revolution and was, part of the beginning of the scientific revolution. Both Kepler and Galileo were strong advocates of this, and Galileo, in much of his work and in his books, in particular in his book, The Dialogue on the Two Chief World System, tried to present evidence that is the correct model of the solar system, which at the time was a model for the universe, they thought. So surely Copernicus is, in some sense, even the father of Galileo, if you like.
Well, so we touched earlier
on... He was himself a polymath, by the way.
Oh, I'm sorry, who?
Great polymath.
Who was?
Copernicus was
really?
A polymath. Yeah.
Oh, how so?
Oh, he knew everything. I mean, there is almost no area in which he didn't work.
Really? I don't know. Yeah. I don't know anything about Copernicus.
Yeah.
Huh. So another question that came in from the audience was from Sheila D'Agostino, who asked, how religious was Galileo? We talked about him being religious, but, I don't know, I guess on the spectrum of like extremely devout to a little bit of religious feeling, where do you put him?
I think that, he certainly described himself as being a religious person. He thought that, scripture was for our salvation and not written as a science book. But he certainly believed that when his beloved daughter, sister Maria Celeste, died, he said that she went to a better world. So he certainly, believed in the main things in Christianity. As a young boy, he himself, we're not entirely sure, but, he at one point he was studying, even towards being himself having a religious position. But he left that when he was relatively young. But he put his two daughters in a convent. I mean, this was not perhaps so much because of religious reasons, but because they were illegitimate daughters. So, her prospects for marriage were not fantastic. So it was quite common to put the girls in a convent at the time. So he did that. When Pope John Paul II said his things about Galileo being right and the theologians wrong, he said, Galileo, a sincere believer. So
I see. Well, you mentioned Galileo's now famous daughter, Sister Maria Celeste. People may not be so familiar with Galileo's wife. If maybe we shouldn't call her his wife, but it was the mother of his children.
Yes,
she was. Marina Gamba is her name. Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, can you tell us a little?
He never married her. But he had 3 children with her. Yeah, 2 daughters and a son. The situation with daughters, unfortunately, at those times was more difficult than with sons, in the sense that to marry daughters, you had to give dowries, and since they were illegitimate daughters, the dowry would have been prohibitive. So he put them in the convent at a very young age. I mean, they were 10 and 9, I think, when he put them in the convent. His beloved daughter died very young, in her 30s. But he really loved her, and she wrote to him much. We have more than 100 letters written by her. And she also used to send him medications and all kinds of things. And she took care of his house when he was in Siena under house arrest for 6 months, the first 6 months of his house arrest. The other daughter, we know very little, Sister Arcangela, we know very little about her. And whatever we know is from the letters of Maria Celeste. She apparently did not adjust very well to the life in the convent. Now, his son, actually, the life of sons was more, easier at the time, and he was eventually legitimized by the Grand Duke, his son.
Do we know why Galileo didn't marry Marina? They seem to have loved each other.
We only know what other people told us. So his brother always thought that he didn't marry her because he wanted to continue to support other parts of his family, and he thought that he couldn't do both. But we don't know. I mean, he may have not been very enthusiastic about the marriage institution from seeing things around him at the time. He also lived a very bizarre life where there were constantly people living in his home because he never had a lot of money, and so he was giving lessons, he was tutoring, and the students stayed at his home. After that, when he started constructing telescopes, the person who was constructing the telescope and his family lived in his home. So, life was more complicated at the time.
Now, when he wrote his last great book, he was essentially blind. Is that right?
Yeah, well, almost, I would say. He was blind for the last 4 years of his life. He was completely blind. And that book, the Discorsi, described mostly his experiments in mechanics, which, we didn't get to talk about much, but his experiments in mechanics and in his thinking in mechanics is phenomenal. I have no other words for this.
Yeah.
Look, one thing, you see, he wanted to study free fall, okay? But there were no good time measuring devices at the time. So he wanted to study whether a lighter ball and a heavier ball, let's say, fall at the same time, or there is a difference. But the differences were very small, and so they couldn't be measured very accurately. But he had this incredibly bright idea of using inclined planes and rolling the balls down in inclined planes, thereby kind of diluting gravity and making the motion much slower.
Yes.
So this was, one thing that he thought about. The other thing, is law of inertia, which turned out eventually to be not Newton's first law of motion, where he said that, in the absence of any forces, a body will just go on moving on a straight line at a constant speed. Now, we know this to be true, and this is Newton's first law of motion, but he could never really see something like this with his eyes, because in real life, there is always some friction in things, right? So no object would go on moving on a straight line without stopping. And yet his intuition told him that it was. And finally, the mathematization of physics, is what? Because before him, there were no, today there are these things we call laws of physics, and we write those in the form of mathematical equations, yes? But when he lived, there were no yet laws of dynamics written down. Nothing existed. He wrote the first ones. He wrote the one that, in free fall, the distance traveled is proportional to the square of the time. Or he discovered that the trajectory of a projectile is a parabola. So he wrote the very first mathematical laws. And yet, even though there were no yet real laws then, he stated that the universe is written in the language of mathematics. This is an incredible insight. Even today, we don't fully understand why mathematics is so powerful in describing all the laws of nature, at least in fundamental physics. But he already had this as an idea.
Yes, well, we in math are very proud to think of Galileo as a mathematician first. Although he
was a mathematician.
Right?
He was a mathematician. His position was of a mathematician.
That's right. So he's never regarded as a mathematician, although he did make actual contributions to mathematics besides physics and astronomy. But, well, all right.
He used geometry excessively.
Yeah.
There was already quite a bit of algebra at his time, and for some reason he didn't use that much.
Yeah, it was a little too newfangled for him. I think he was very classical that way, but he was thinking about infinity. So he did have ideas at the beginning of calculus.
Right.
Okay, well, here's a question from, let's see. All right, this is an interesting one, the hard one, from Barbara Sullivan, who asked, if Galileo were alive today or could speak to us today, what do you think he would tell us?
I think he would be horrified about, our witnessing almost the death of facts. I think he would be horrified by that. I gave that quote from Hannah Arendt. And this is why understanding the distinction between what is fact and what isn't is so important. Today, we have alternative facts and other words for facts. Yes. We have COVID-19. How come the World Health Organization has not understood COVID-19 when it's not COVID-1? We were told that.
Okay.
Yes, when 19 refers to the year. Yes, things like that. So we have a death of facts, and I think that would absolutely horrify him. Another thing that he would find almost impossible, I think, to understand is, and we didn't talk much about that, this business of the second culture, the apparent schism between the humanities and the sciences. To him, there was no, dividing line between humanities and sciences. He, like I said, he liked the arts. He liked poetry. He wrote poetry. He was a musician. He had painter friends and all that. He studied drawing himself. And he was a scientist. And there were others at this time, Leonardo da Vinci, Brunelleschi, others who were both scientists and artists. He would not have understood what C.P. Snow called the second culture, that some people in the literary world exclude scientists from, the intellectuals. Mm-hmm. He would not have understood that. So he would have had many surprises, I think. And he probably would have had something. I mean, knowing Galileo, I'm sure he would have had something to say about that.
Well,
I
all
want
right.
to emphasize one thing even before you ask the next question.
Okay, sure.
Because I may have given the impression that Galileo was always right. No, he was many times wrong. Okay, let's make this very, very clear. He has the theory of the tides, which was completely wrong, completely wrong. He had a theory of comets. He didn't believe that comets were real objects. He thought that this was just refraction in the atmosphere and things like that. And so he definitely was wrong on a number of occasions, and sometimes completely wrong. But nevertheless, he was many times right. And on the big things, he had a good intuition. I mean, look, in the case of the Copernican system, yes, I mean, you can argue to death that he couldn't prove that the Earth was moving, but nevertheless, that turned out to be the correct theory. So, he had an intuition that sometimes helped him.
So this question of being wrong reminds me of one of your wonderful books, Brilliant Blunders, about the fruitfulness of mistakes in science. Yes. And I don't remember if he was one of the characters in the book.
No, he wasn't. He wasn't. No.
Do we have any example? I mean, I'm aware of he had the law of falling bodies wrong, and he corrected his own mistake.
Yeah, that one he corrected.
But are there examples where he made a mistake and someone else pointed it out and he admitted his own error? Could he admit that he was wrong to someone other than himself? I can't think of any.
You know what? I think he didn't. Look, on the case of the tides, Kepler and others actually already suggested that it may be the influence of the moon. But Galileo was a very mechanical person. And he did not believe in forces acting across distance, such as gravity. So he could not have been Newton. Okay,
That's interesting.
He could not have been Newton. He really didn't have that type of grasp of being a Newton. So he wasn't that. In the case of the comets, he was wrong, well, there wasn't anybody who was completely right on that either, but he was absolutely wrong. In the cases of sunspots, he was right about the nature of sunspots, but there was another Jesuit mathematician and scientist named Scheiner who actually eventually wrote the most authoritative book on sunspots. And he was right, and Galileo never really acknowledged that he wrote that great book, and that actually acted against him when it came to his trial. So no, he was not of the type that would admit his errors. He did admit towards the end that there is a phrase where he says that something that. He's happy that he managed to discover some things, and he hopes that minds more astute than his in the future will discover even more things and understand better these things. Yeah.
All right. Well, let me continue with a question from Nick Acker and Laura Katzman, who asked about Giordano Bruno. Yes. We haven't talked about him yet. Talk about getting in trouble with the church. He paid the ultimate price. So their question is, did you discover anything new about Giordano Bruno during your research?
No, I cannot say that I did. But look, I did not devote as much time to Giordano Bruno as I did to Galileo, because clearly I wrote a book about Galileo. But from the little I looked, I did not. What is sometimes a misconception is that he was burnt at the stake because he believed in the Copernican system. And that was, of course, not the case. He was a pain in the neck, Giordano Bruno, to the church. He just kept, being very offensive and things. And Galileo eventually recanted and did an abjuration, which was in itself actually, I think, a very shameful event. But he did that, and as a result, he managed to escape being convicted of being heretical. He was just vehemently suspected of heresy, while Giordano Bruno was, heretical, and so he was not burned because of his Copernican views. He was burned because of a whole series of philosophical issues that he had. But he was definitely an interesting character, and in one thing, which to him was kind of mystical, but still turned out to be correct, that he thought that there were many stars, and there is life in many other places and things like that, and so on. And that, of course, today we know that there are, even just in the Milky Way galaxy, there are billions of stars and Earth-sized planets roughly, orbiting those stars in the habitable zone, which allows for liquid water. So Giordano Bruno, in that sense, turned out to be correct too.
But though we could say, though he got lucky, he wasn't a scientist. He made a good guess, but compare him to Galileo, who had real data and reasons for his arguments. Giordano Bruno was a pure philosopher, I think.
Right.
Okay, Beth, hello.
Hi, gentlemen. I'm so sorry, but we are running out of time and are going to have to wrap up. So if you'd like to maybe take one more question, and then I'll bring.
All right. Okay. Well, actually, rather than a question, I wanted to read a comment that I thought was very sweet that someone made, which is from Carmen Leclerc, who says, not a question, just a comment on the subject of art. You, Professor Livio, have a lovely collection of modern and post-impressionist artists behind you. Who says there are no more Renaissance men?
Certainly not.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And thank you both, Professors Straugetz and Livio. This has been really, really lovely. I thank everybody in the audience also for joining us tonight. Again, your support is what helps Politics and Prose through these times, getting the books to you and bringing this content to you. So hit that green button below and purchase Galileo and the Science Deniers. It is a good read. You will enjoy it. So also, I'll direct you to the Politics and Prose website. While you're there buying your book, you can hit on the blue button. It's our events calendar. We have a bunch of great events coming up on Crowdcast and on other platforms. Check that out. And until next time, I really hope you stay well and stay well read. Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye,
Good night.
everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye.